All right. It's the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Participants will be muted during the broadcast today. So if you have any comments during the session, go ahead and use the chat tool like you would in a normal Zoom meeting. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's broadcast. So I'll plan to get through as many of your questions as I can in our allotted time. What I would like you to do for questions is, instead of using the chat tool, if you would use the Q&A tool towards the middle of your black Zoom toolbar. Well, my bar's black. I assume everyone's is, but either way, says Q&A. Shouldn't be hard to find. So any questions that you're coming to the session with today, or that come to mind as we're walking through our diversity, equity, and inclusion information, can be put in the Q&A section. Questions can be asked anonymously. There's a little button you have to check if you'd like to ask your question anonymously. And if you see your question already asked, you can upvote it to raise it closer to the top of the list. So I'll give you a quick introduction before we walk through our agenda. My name's Liza Town. I'm an HR consultant coming to you live from America's Heartland in Nebraska. So I'm a few hours away from those of you that are in the Denver area, and I do believe that most of the folks in this group are. I get to the area as often as I can. I love Colorado. So yeah, so that is me. I will go ahead and direct your attention to our agenda. Thank you all for joining us to speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. At a high level, here's what we would like to cover. First, we'll talk about why we're here, why this is such an important topic. Second, we'll talk about what you need to know about DE&I strategies and best practices. And we'll talk about how you can help create an intentional culture with positive DE&I outcomes for your organization. So here's what we want to accomplish together today. Our learning objectives are to understand the bottom line outcomes that result from strong DE&I practices. Shift the mindset from DE&I as a check the box activity to a business imperative. We'll talk about how to create an intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that focuses on business outcomes, not just the initiatives in the strategy. We'll give you the tools you need to create a thriving culture rooted in DE&I best practices, empower you to create an inclusive work environment, and ultimately move towards a true transformation for your organization. So let's start with the why. Why do diversity, equity, and inclusion matter? So let's look at some statistics. McKinsey has been examining diversity in the workplace for several years. In their latest report, Diversity Matters, they found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So that's real financial returns. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are also 15% more likely. Couldn't get my slide to advance here. There we go. Okay, so along with real financial returns, we want to help you expand your customer base. So increasing diversity opens up new customer markets, right? So customers, vendors, and other business partners are looking for an organization that can understand an increasingly multicultural and multifaceted consumer base. They're looking for a company that can demonstrate cultural intelligence and are aligned by shared values. So a diverse team is better equipped to connect your customers to your brand. In fact, Accenture reports that 70% of millennial age consumers are more likely to choose one brand over another if that brand demonstrates inclusion and diversity. So along with expanding your customer base, DE&I practices can also help you attract top talent. So Glassdoor says that 72% of women, 89% of African Americans, 80% of Asians, and 70% of Latinos ranked workforce diversity as paramount in their job search. It's really important to folks. Diversity in organizations opens the talent pool, right, to a wider, more competitive market of candidates. It increases the likelihood of finding that perfect candidate for you. We also know that millennial and Gen Z generations are the most diverse in history. So only 56% of the 87 million millennials in the US are white. And that's compared to 72% of the 76 million baby boomers. So we're becoming a less white nation overall. So diversity in the workforce means having a multitude of different cultures, educational backgrounds, and points of view present. These cultural, educational, and conceptual perspectives provide a richness of ideas that lead to stronger outcomes, right? So that makes diversity a proven ingredient in creativity and innovation in the workplace. On the other side of the coin, a lack of diversity in the leadership of an organization really hampers innovation and prohibits members of minority groups from being recognized for their contributions. So the Harvard Business Review reports that companies that don't have diverse leadership, women are 20% less likely than straight white men to win endorsement for their ideas. People of color are 24% less likely, and those that identify as LGBTQ are 21% less likely. So when we have a leadership team, or even just a group of employees that are all from the same background, right? They're coming from the same perspective. So monocultural workforces are susceptible to groupthink. We all think about things the same way, for the most part, if we're all the same, right? That can be really isolating to an organization, make it less relevant and less viable in the long term. So why aren't more companies realizing the benefits of a good DE&I practice? 41% of leaders in Fortune 1000 companies claim that they weren't implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives because they're too busy. They don't see the great return on that investment, right? And 43% of workers in the US still believe that discussions about race are inappropriate at work. But if we don't talk about these things, how can we help? How can we make them better? So let's talk about some basic definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's really important, I think, to clarify that diversity, equity, and inclusion are each unique terms and concepts and that come with unique strategies. So people tend to use these terms interchangeably or lump them all together in one strategy, but you don't have to do that. So let's define diversity. That means the representation of different thoughts, opinions, and types of people in an organization. Inclusion then means that individuals with different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed in the workplace. And equity means that everyone in the organization receives fair and equal treatment and has equal access to opportunities at work. So workplace diversity does not necessarily equal workplace inclusion. So these pictures are just a very simple description of that, right? So on the left, you have diversity, all the different puzzle pieces, different colors, all jumbled together in one workplace, right? But it's kind of a mess. It's not that nothing's working together, right? Until you have inclusion. And on the right, you see all of these puzzle pieces fitting together, working cohesively. So that's the difference between diversity and inclusion. Equality means equal opportunity, whereas equity means equal access. So in this image, the person on the left is taller, right? That's a privilege. They're able to reach what the shortest person can't get to. On the right, when the less privileged are armed with the resources that offer the same opportunities as their peers, fairness is achieved. So in other words, equality is the end goal and equity is the means to get there. So let's talk about some strategies and best practices for diversity. So in the United States, here are some basic statistics on diversity. 97% of senior executive boards in the US fail to reflect the country's labor force and population demographics. Senior executive boards tend to be white, male, and straight. 4.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female. That's just 25. That's of March of 2019, and it is up, right, from 2.4% in 2008, but we still have a long way to go. 20% of companies don't have female leaders at all, and 50% of companies don't have people of color in leadership roles. Now, diversity in the workplace is more than just race or gender, right? Diversity means nationality, age, educational level, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, which is different than race, sexual orientation, disability, etc. So there's a lot that goes into having a diverse workforce. So here's a few diversity strategies that really aren't going to yield you the outcomes that you want. Number one, that high profile diversity hire, right? Number two, diversity in your marketing materials that doesn't really reflect your actual workforce. And number three, being colorblind. So, the more folks say, well, I'm colorblind, this company is colorblind. When we say that, we're really negating and ignoring the contributions that folks of different races and backgrounds bring to the table. So how do we achieve diversity in the workplace? A couple basic strategies. Conduct an external benchmarking in each location and compare it with your internal data, right? Are your management roles primarily filled by older white men? Does the accounting department tend to hire only women? If you have a Denver location, is it primarily white? Take a look at what does your local market externally look like compared to what your employees look like. Set realistic goals, build intentional hiring strategies to reach members of those populations. And we'll talk a little bit more about intentional hiring strategies. One thing you could do is embed diversity practices right into your existing recruiting process, right? So you can create partnerships with minority-owned recruiting firms if you need help recruiting. Even if you don't need help recruiting, establish long-term relationships with minority organizations in your industry, in your local community, and then advertise on those on their job boards and their publications, et cetera. Encourage and reward diversity in your employee referral program. So let's take a peek at Colorado's diversity mix. Colorado itself is becoming increasingly diverse. So in this graph, we're 2020, right? Pretty close to the middle, right? Colorado right now is 66.3% white. What you'll notice is we're getting less and less white as time goes on, right? By 2050, Colorado will be only 52.8% white, give or take. So let's talk about some strategies to achieve diversity in in your hiring process. One thing that you can do is demonstrate inclusivity in your hiring process by posting a diversity statement or your cultural practices on your website, Facebook, Instagram, all that good stuff, your career page. I've got a really neat example towards the end of this session where we'll see what one company has done with their diversity statements. Highlight employee benefits that promote and support equity. Use employee testimonial videos if that's appropriate. Create diverse interview teams. Folks should be made up of different age groups, races, genders, sexual orientations, etc. And then think about conducting bias training for your managers. So let's talk a little bit about bias training. So a little bias 101 for you. So what I'd like to do is give you a break from me talking. Let's do a little activity. We want to talk about why our intentions matter. So when I do this exercise face-to-face with a group, I give them a little handout that looks similar to this, right? Just a really quick table. If you have a pen and paper handy, go ahead and grab them. If not, you can totally do this in your head. What I'd like you to do is identify your top 5 closest friends. So not your family, right? The people that you intentionally surround yourself with, that you've chosen to build relationships with. So write them down, who are your top 5 closest friends, and then write down their characteristics. How old are they? What gender are they? What race, sexual orientation, how much education do they have? Are they married or not? Do they have kids or not? And while you're doing that, writing it or thinking about that, I'm going to launch a poll. This is totally anonymous. You should be able to see that poll on your screen. What I would like to know of that list, how similar are your closest friends to you? Are they very similar, maybe only 1 or 2 differences, somewhat similar to you, or are your 5 closest friends just not at all similar to you? Be as honest as you can. It's totally anonymous. And then after maybe another 20 seconds or so, we'll go ahead and share these results so everyone can see kind of what the group said. Looks like about 65% of you have voted so far, so we'll give it a little bit longer. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and end our polling. Thank you to everyone that participated, and I'll share these results. Okay. So look at this. 46% of you said that your top 5 closest friends are very similar to you. 46% said that they are somewhat similar to you, right? And then only 8% said that your top 5 closest friends are not at all similar to you. What we find is results like this are pretty standard, right? Most people surround themselves with people that are very much like them, right? It's human nature. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we say intention matters, this is why you have to actually intentionally go out if you want to, start having conversations about different worldviews, different, ways of thinking, different cultural norms. You actually have to intentionally go and seek folks out to build relationships with. So just a little food for thought. So I'll stop sharing those results. Let's talk about bias. So bias usually comes across as kind of a bad word, right? There are really 2 different kinds of bias. So we're going to talk about both, but I'd like to focus first on unconscious bias or implicit bias, as opposed to conscious or explicit bias. So unconscious bias is a term that's used to describe the associations that we hold, which, even though they're outside of our conscious awareness, can have a significant influence on our attitudes, our behavior. So regardless of how fair-minded we believe ourselves to be, most people have some degree of unconscious bias on board. So that means that we automatically respond to others, people from different racial or ethnic groups, for example, in positive or negative ways. So these associations can be really difficult to override, regardless of whether we recognize them to be right or wrong, because they're really deeply ingrained into our thinking and our emotions. So with implicit or unconscious bias, that operates outside of our personal awareness, right? It can be in direct contradiction to our espoused beliefs and values. Conscious or explicit bias, on the other hand, the person is very clear about their feelings and attitudes. Their behaviors are conducted with intent. Conscious or explicit bias can be characterized by really overtly negative behavior or through more subtle means, such as exclusion, microaggressions, etc. So there's a lot of science behind unconscious bias. So here's a few facts that we know. Unconscious bias develops at an early age. So these things start happening in middle childhood and they develop across childhood. So when we're kids, we're getting all this information, from the media, from our peers, from our older siblings and our parents and our teachers and, clergy, and we're kind of absorbing all of that. We're little sponges, right? And so these unconscious biases just become ingrained in us. And they do have real world effects on behavior. But here's the good news. Unconscious biases are malleable. So that means that we can take steps to minimize the impact of those biases in our lives. So there's been a lot of research published demonstrating the impact of unconscious bias in various domains, including criminal justice and education and healthcare and in the workplace. So bias may have an impact on hiring and mentoring. So a couple case studies I'd like to point out. And the first one, fictitious resumes with either white sounding or African American sounding names were sent in response to a job posting. So there were no real material differences between the qualifications of the folks in these fictitious resumes, right? It was just the names, the way their names sounded. But the resumes with white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. So hiring managers in another study rated male applicants for a lab manager position as significantly more competent than their equally skilled female counterparts. They also went a step further, and hiring managers selected higher starting wages, offered more career advancement and mentoring opportunities to the male candidates. So we were talking about unconscious bias. How can I address those if I don't know that I have them? Well, the I don't know that I have them argument really, it becomes less and less of an excuse for not addressing your unconscious biases. This has been talked about in the media. We're talking about it today. It does take work, intention, and commitment, but if you want to be part of fostering a more inclusive world, it truly does start with your own work. So by definition, unconscious means that we're not aware. But here are 5 ways to uncover and be more aware of your unconscious biases. So step 1, assume that you have them, because we all do. Very simple. Step 2, conduct research on yourself. So what are some behaviors that suggest you might have some hidden biases about particular groups? If you are in the position to make hiring decisions, do you hire the same type of people all the time? Do you find that racial, ethnic, gender, LGBT differences are something that you would rather not talk about or address? Does that make you uncomfortable? Do you laugh at jokes about other groups? Step 3, make a list of groups that are different from you and from your group, and then look really critically at your behavior towards those groups. It is human nature, like I said earlier, to gravitate towards people that are like us, to be more positive about groups to which we belong. But for the groups that you're not a part of, do you interact at all with those groups? Do you know much about those groups? And what adjectives would you use to describe folks in those groups? So you've done your own research on yourself. Now ask another person, trusted friend, an associate, how they perceive you. So this can be really tough, right? You're asking someone to give you really honest feedback, but we all know that person that's going to give it to us like it is. So tell them that it's really important to you, and then ask what are some behaviors that they've noticed that might suggest that you have an unconscious bias on board. And then finally, examine your worldview. So do you tend to think in absolutes? Are things really black and white, good or bad? Something that might not be right for you, can you understand how it could be right for another person? Do you tend to make quick judgments about what you see, or are you more reflective until you have additional information? And when you see behaviors that are different, do you interpret them from your own cultural lens, or are you able to take a step back and describe those things with more neutral terms? Another idea is to test yourself for hidden biases. So you can go to understandingprejudice.org. If you don't have a pen to write down any website I give you today, no worries, we'll send this deck out. You can go to understandingprejudice.org, and they have implicit association tests, or IATs. You could just test yourself to see if you might have any unconscious bias on board that you're not aware of. So before we move on and talk about inclusion strategies, I'll just give another quick shout out for the Q&A session at the end of our broadcast today. If anything we're talking about is making you think, if you have any questions, you can ask them. You could even ask them anonymously using the QA tool in your webinar tools. So inclusion strategies and best practices. I love this quote. So you can mandate diversity, but you can't mandate inclusion. So inclusion is about behavior and relationships. You have to change hearts and minds. So you could say, okay, we have a diversity initiative, we're mandating diversity, right? And get this great diverse workforce. And you can't mandate the inclusion piece. That's about really changing your behavior and making sure that you're modeling what you expect the rest of your workforce to behave. So let's talk about inclusive leadership. Harvard Business Group researched 6 traits that distinguish inclusive leaders from others. So an inclusive leader is going to show visible commitment. So they articulate an authentic commitment to diversity. They challenge the status quo and hold others accountable to diversity as a priority. They show humility. So they're modest about their capabilities. They admit their mistakes, and they create space for others to contribute. Inclusive leaders are, they show awareness of bias. So if they have any personal blind spots, they'll show awareness of that, as well as any flaws in the system, and they'll work hard to ensure meritocracy. Inclusive leaders are curious about others, so they demonstrate an open mindset and a deep curiosity. They listen without judgment, seek with empathy to understand the people around them. They demonstrate cultural intelligence. This is a big one, I think. They're attentive to other cultures, and they adapt as required in their leadership style and their approach. And finally, inclusive leaders are effective collaborators. So they empower others, they pay attention to diversity of thinking, psychological safety, and focus on team cohesion. So some strategies to achieve inclusion in the workplace. So think about investing in skill building that strengthens awareness and appreciation for different perspectives. So is it conflict resolution training and techniques? Do you have programs that focus on building relationships? You can even do things like start a book club, have guest speakers and lunch and learn, to create some cultural awareness. Consider inviting your workforce to take the To Be Welcoming courses offered by Starbucks. They're free. We'll talk about those at the end of the session. Promote healthy relationships and friendships among colleagues through social or community involvement. And provide employees with a safe space to voice their concerns. So have a listening session, send out an employee survey, anonymous reporting portal, something to give employees the opportunity to tell you how they're feeling. You've got to actively solicit that kind of feedback most often. So let's talk about creating space for that honest conversation, right? So say you're going to have a listening session. There's some steps here. Step 1 is to actually listen, right? It's crucial to understand the current state of your company culture. So be prepared to be comfortable being uncomfortable is a great way to put it, because if you're genuinely listening and actively soliciting that feedback, employees from all levels and experiences of the workplace, you're going to hear the good and the bad and the ugly, the positive and the negative. But that's really key to getting a transparent view of your company culture, right? Step 2, take action. So listening alone is not enough, but it does form the basis for taking action towards a more inclusive culture. So make sure your employees feel heard by showing that their feedback results in tangible improvements where necessary. So say you send out an employee culture survey. Great, you gave them an opportunity to give their opinion. Now tell them what you heard and tell them what you're going to do about it. right? You want to value all input. So company culture and what it means to belong feels different to different people. When deciding where to focus your efforts, for example, you want to be truly inclusive. A positive workplace culture supports both senior and junior employees and folks from all backgrounds to create a sense of belonging for everyone. And step 4, form two-way communication. And there goes my slide. Good grief. So two-way communication. You want to foster an inclusive environment. So it's important that employees feel like they can speak up and they'll be heard anytime. So highlight your open door policy if you have one. If you don't have one, get one, right? Ensure that employees know that their opinions don't have to wait for that listening section or for that survey to come out, right? Now, a few more strategies to achieve inclusion. I would caution you to focus on the people that are already employed in your organization first, right? Value their differences and create an environment where people can feel comfortable bringing their full selves to work. Maybe develop an inclusive decision-making process. So for an example, an all-white male leadership team makes decisions that are executed by a gender diverse group. Form a diverse committee to be a sounding board for leadership if your leadership team is not so diverse. Hold managers accountable to lead by example and be your inclusion architects, right? Quickly address inappropriate behaviors and comments. Don't allow employees to demean each other. Don't allow microaggressions to go on in the workplace, etc. Consider celebrating holidays that are not just the US recognized holidays, right? Juneteenth, Gay Pride, International Day of Person with Disabilities, International Women's Day. These holidays are important to people in your workforce. And when you choose to celebrate these holidays, even if it's not with a paid holiday or a day off, but you just make it a big deal, make an announcement, that shows your employees that you're tuned in, right? Define and embrace inclusive language as an organization and agree to hold each other accountable to that. An example, and this is one that's really hard for me. Guys is not a gender neutral term, right? You would think, well, that's a no-brainer, right? But I can't tell you how many times I say, hey guys, or send an email to a group of women and say, hello ladies, and these are not gender neutral terms. And so that language is not very inclusive. So just some food for thought there. So speaking of gender neutral terms, etc., let's talk about a gender inclusive work environment. So this is our gender unicorn. So you may have seen this before. We use the gender unicorn to talk about the differences between gender identity and expression, orientation, etc. So everybody has a gender identity. Most people just don't think about it a lot because their gender identity matches their sex at birth. But that's not the case for everyone. So that's why we really want to talk through this with leaders especially. So gender identity refers to an individual's personal sense of having a particular gender. So a person's gender identity could be female, male, or other. A gender expression is the way in which a person expresses their gender identity. So that's typically going to be through the way they present themselves, their appearance, the way they dress, the way they talk, their behavior. Gender expression can be more feminine, more masculine, a little bit of both, other. And then sexual orientation is a person's identity in relation to the gender or genders to which they are sexually attracted, and also who they're emotionally or romantically attracted to, right? So regardless of a person's gender identity or expression, their sexual attraction is then just who they're attracted to, right? So it could be men, could be women, could be other genders, more than one gender, etc. So some terminology. A birth name refers to the name that we were given at birth. So for example, my birth name is Liza. A living name refers to the name that a transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming person may choose to use. So not everybody that transitions, chooses a new living name. But when they do, then dead naming is a term for calling a trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming person by their former birth name. It's really disrespectful. Gender dysphoria occurs when a person experiences serious emotional distress due to the gender that they were assigned at birth differing from the gender that they know themselves to be. So again, not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, but for those that do, using incorrect pronouns, dead naming can really contribute to that stress and can contribute to a hostile work environment. So if we want to create a gender-inclusive work environment, we can do a few simple things. We can use terms like cis or cisgender when we're speaking about people who live as the sex that they were assigned at birth, as opposed to terms like normal. If I say normal, that could be considered discriminatory, as it sets those who are not cisgender apart. It says you're not normal, you're other, right? Using pronouns is a really important way to show respect for a person's gender identity. So you could consider adding a pronoun block to your organization's email signature. For example, my email says Liza Town. Under that, in parentheses, it says she/her. Those are my pronouns. Now, some people prefer gendered pronouns like he, him, she, her. Others prefer more gender neutral terms, right? They, them, or they might be comfortable with several different pronouns. When in doubt, ask. It's fine to ask. It's respectful, but create a culture where that respect outweighs your discomfort, right? Be aware of how your employees are treating each other. So allowing people to dead name, make jokes, inappropriate comments, complain about somebody's choice of restroom, etc., could lead to unlawful harassment claims. And as soon as an employee announces their intent to transition, be prepared to respect their choice of name, their pronouns, their restrooms, etc. So I want to share a quick video with you. This is Ashley Wild. It's a YouTube video. It's about 3 minutes long. Ashley talks about what it's like to be misgendered, how that feels as a trans person, and what you can do if you accidentally misgender someone. So about 3 minutes, and then we'll talk about it and move on.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Wild and welcome to my channel, Ashley's Wildlife. This week on the Gender Resources playlist, what to do if you have accidentally misgendered someone. This video is inspired by the fact that I am misgendered almost constantly, and specifically motivated by something that happened to me this past week. I am in the waiting room at a doctor's office, waiting for the doctor to come out and tell me information about my mom. I've never seen the doctor before, she's never seen me before. We have only ever spoken on the phone. I am the only person in the waiting room. And suddenly a woman comes in, so I say, hi. She looks around the room and says, hi, and then leaves. Then I get a phone call, and it's the doctor. She says, hey, I'm not sure where you are. I looked for you in the waiting room. I'm like, well, I'm in the waiting room. So she says, oh, I must have missed you. And she comes back, and she looks at me, and what she decides to say is, hey, pretty lady. What? This story sparked something for me, and what it sparked for me is how uncomfortable it makes people to treat trans individuals like regular human beings. If you misgender someone, you should treat it the way you would treat anything that you accidentally do that is rude. If you're a waitress and you're serving a table and you accidentally step on the toe of the customer, you don't stop and be like, great shoes. No, you politely apologize for stepping on their toe and you get back to the business of being a waitress. It was so uncomfortable and so isolating in that moment to feel like on top of misgendering me, which was an accident, but it still doesn't feel good. Now you're overcompensating, trying to get on my good side. This is a different conversation if we're talking about friends or family or someone who you are going to have a lasting relationship with, but this is a functional situation. Don't get on my good side. Apologize for the rude thing that you did, and then go back to treating me like a regular human being. I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm a pretty lady. I need a doctor to tell me how my mom is doing. I need you to treat me the same way you would treat anybody else. It's embarrassing when you realize that you've misgendered someone. And I get it. It's awkward. You don't know what to do. So here's what you do. Just apologize and treat me like a regular person. Because gender isn't visible, because it's something that we feel and we know about ourselves, misgendering will probably always happen. If you want to avoid misgendering to the best of your ability, ask someone what their pronouns are and how they would want to be referred to. But in any case, we all make mistakes. So just, if you misgender someone and you're uncomfortable, don't make your discomfort that person's problem. Apologize and let it go. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye. I'm running a Patreon campaign.
All right. I always try to stop before she starts talking about Patreon, but it's a challenge for me. So, couple more points on gender and having respect for folks' gender choices, right? Assumptions kill inclusivity. So some do's and don'ts. Don't ask, for example, what does your husband or wife do, right? Instead, maybe ask, what does your partner do, right? Don't assume gender identity based on perceived sex. So that was kind of what Ashley was talking about in that video, right? That doctor perceived their sex and then behaved accordingly. Instead, ask, what are your pronouns? Don't ask invasive questions regarding an employee or a coworker's transition. Instead, consider whether your question is a need to know or a nice to know. Are you just curious, or is this a business imperative, the question you're about to ask? And if it's a nice to know, just educate yourself. There's lots of information out there. Okay, so let's talk about equity strategies and best practices. So there is an intersection between equity and inclusion. I love this quote. Inclusion is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. So some strategies to achieve racial and gender equity. First and foremost, pay equity, ensuring that all employees in the same role with similar experience and performance are paid very similarly, right? Colorado's equal pay for equal work law goes into effect in January. Are you ready for that? Have you ensured that you have job descriptions for all of your roles? Have you ensured that you have pay scales assigned to those job descriptions and that you're ready to be completely transparent by sharing those pay ranges when you post positions? Parental leave policies are another way, to show equity by allowing adoptive and birth parents the same time away. Healthcare. So evaluate your healthcare plans to ensure that they support gender equity. So example, same-sex spousal benefits, transgender medical care, etc. In the workplace, have a gender-neutral restroom if you're able to. And if you're not, ensure that folks are able to use the restroom of their choice based on their gender identity. For those with disabilities, have accessible workspaces available. So when it comes to career advancement and internal promotions, ensure that you're posting all job openings internally and fairly competing that role. Good to start doing that now because it will be a requirement in Colorado in January, right? So do it now if you're not doing it already. Ensure that folks internally know about every role. Even if you don't think the right candidate is internal, it's a really good idea to ensure that folks have that opportunity to apply. In your recruiting practices, couple things: train hiring managers on equitable candidate evaluations, right? A really good idea is to use an interview guide that has scoring. It really takes the guesswork out of interviewing for folks, especially if they don't have as much experience in that arena. An interview guide makes sure that candidates are all being asked the same questions and that the questions are, sound legally, etc. You could also consider skills-based hiring practices. So let's talk about skills-based hiring. So skills-based hiring structures your company's hiring process around competencies needed to do a job. It removes credential requirements for many positions. Obviously, you know, if you are, say, in the healthcare industry, you can't remove credential requirements for your healthcare professionals, right? That's a no-brainer. But there are plenty of positions that you may be able to, right? Like your office manager, like folks that, you know, the credential may not be as important as the skills and the knowledge and the abilities necessary to do the job. Use competencies specific to the job to define the hiring process. Skills-based hiring can reduce bias to remove barriers for qualified candidates. So this would be an example of a barrier, right? Take a look at the educational attainment of folks 25 and older by race and ethnicity in the United States. You can see that there is inequity in education. Not everyone has the same opportunity to education as their peers, right? If you look at attainment for bachelor's degree, you'll see that folks that are white and Asian are more likely to have attained a bachelor's degree. When you look at master's degrees and above, you'll see again, there's a real disparity there. So if you're looking simply at the credentials that someone has, you're really closing yourself off in most cases to candidates that may be just as qualified as far as their skills and their experience, but not as qualified on paper, right? So the first thing when you talk about skills-based hiring is, what does that job posting look like? It's not just what you consider internally, right? When you're thinking about what kind of person to reach out and find, but what are you putting out to the world in your job posting? So a pedigree-based or you know, a classic job posting uses credentials, right? Degrees, how many years of work experience to assume a particular skill level. There's going to be a list of qualifications on that job posting. And there can often be some unintentional bias because it's creating barriers to qualified candidates. A skills-based job posting uses competencies instead of credentials to attract candidates with the skills needed. So instead of assuming skill level based on years of experience or their degree, they're saying, here's the skill you need to demonstrate. Now, a candidate could demonstrate that skill through the interview process, could demonstrate that skill through former work experience or an assessment. There's many ways to get to skill level. Skills-based job postings also distinguish qualifications. So between things that are absolutely required and things that are preferred, nice to haves, right? Need to have and nice to have. So what I want to do here is just share a PDF. This is an example of a pedigree job posting and a skills-based job posting. So the position for this posting is recruiter. In both job postings, you'll see that there is a job summary and the responsibilities and activities that the expectations of the job, right? In a pedigree-based job posting, underneath that, you have qualifications. Requires a bachelor's degree in a related field. So keep in mind, this is a position for a posting for a recruiter. So what's the related field there? I don't believe there's a bachelor's degree in recruiting. So is it HR? Is it business? Do you want that recruiter to have a bachelor's degree in that's related to the positions that they'll be recruiting for, right? Are they recruiting IT positions, so they need an IT degree? So this related field doesn't tell us much. It just says, you know, if you don't have a bachelor's, we really don't want to talk to you. Minimum of 1 year of experience, working in a recruiting environment, and the rest of the qualifications, okay? A skills-based job posting, then if I scroll down here, it's the same as the top, right? Title is recruiter. You've got your job summary, your responsibilities and activities. Fantastic. And then instead of qualifications, you have competencies. So the required competencies for this position, interview and assessment techniques, process improvement, interpersonal skills, judgment and decision making. That's very important for a recruiter, right? Writing. These are things that they need to be, they need to show that they have, right? So how we do that, is it through the resume review? Is it through interview questions and assessment? There's several ways to go about that. And then you've got some preferred competencies. Employment law would be really nice to know, that your recruiter understands employment law, since they're the first contact usually with your organization. Recruitment software, be really cool if they knew how to use your applicant tracking system, right? Preferred, but not required. And persuasion. So it's just a different way to go about explaining what is needed for a position without showing bias. So another little activity here, I'm going to do another poll for you. We'll launch this. After looking at that recruiter job description, pedigree versus skills-based, I would really like to know, for that particular position, should education be a key requirement for that role? So I'm going to launch this poll, and we'll give everyone 30 seconds to vote. Should education be a key requirement for that recruiter position? What is that degree telling us? And we'll give it another 15 seconds or so. A little over half of you have voted so far. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'll share our results. Thank you for participating. Okay, so 23% of you said yes, education should be a key requirement for that recruiter position. 77% of you said no. The folks that said yes, one thing I hear is a bachelor's degree, right? Having a degree, having that education shows that, they're committed, that they can see something through, et cetera, et cetera. And that's fine, right? That's the way you're looking at it, and that's part of your selection process. Okay. Overall, though, what we see in these polls is overwhelmingly folks say, no, we don't really think education should be required for that position. So, the moral of the story is there's no right or wrong answer here. Thank you for sharing your opinion. It's food for thought. So before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about biased language. So like I said earlier, guys is not a gender neutral term, right? Without realizing it, we all use language that's gender coded. Society has certain expectations of what men do, what women do, how they differ, and that seeps into the language that we use all the time. So there is a gender decoder that you can test the language in your job ads, in your job descriptions, in any communication, really. It's the URL is right here in the deck, and we will send this out. Be kind of a fun exercise, right? To just run one of your job ads through a gender decoder and see what it comes up with. So we've talked about, some strategies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to just kind of round our session out by talking about, how do we put all that together? How do we build our DE&I strategy? What does that look like? So a simple 3-step approach is, first we evaluate, where are we at? Where are our gaps? Next, we design our strategy, and then we launch it. So step 1, to evaluate, you want to consider where your gaps are. Is your gap with diversity, equity, or inclusion? Or is it, just one? Is it 2? Is it all of them? Identify your objectives, right? So where can DE&I complement your current business strategy? You want to solicit input from your employees first, right? Climate survey, listening session, etc., to align with your employees on your strengths and your gaps. And then narrow it down, find 2 or 3 focus areas. Don't try to boil the ocean here, right? Especially if this is your first shot at a DE&I strategy. Don't bite off more than you can chew. The next step is to design your strategy. So focus on the outcome. What's going to move your business forward, not on the flashy, pretty initiative, right? Initiatives don't have to be huge. They don't have to take forever. They don't even have to involve money half of the time. Just focus on the outcome, not the initiative itself, first, and then build your initiative around that. Just remember that diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies are interrelated. So a good example of this is diversity. If your gap is diversity, focus first on building an inclusive work environment so that when you launch your diversity recruiting strategy, your organization is ready to embrace your diverse new hires, right? So remember, you can mandate diversity, but you can't mandate inclusion. And then create a recruiting strategy that brings diversity to key roles, levels, and departments. And step 3, launch that strategy. So draft a statement, right, that outlines your organization's commitment to DE&I. Identify the immediate focus areas that complement your current business strategy, and then share your long-term goals. Launch an internal campaign first to tell your employees about your strategy. Identify how your employees can contribute to your strategy, both in action and in their behaviors. Share externally next, right? After you've talked internally about it, share externally by highlighting your commitments through your website, in your marketing strategy, job ads, etc., and ground your DE&I commitment in your core values. So this is a great example of how one organization has done just that, right? They're grounding their strategy in their core values, and they're evangelizing on their website and their social media about what they're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So some great, really simple statements here. We consider the bigger picture, knowing our work goes beyond ourselves. We're not afraid of the less traveled path if it holds true to our values and betters the world. We seek balance by taking into account multiple perspectives and listening deeply. We advocate for diverse backgrounds and perspectives to make our team and our products stronger. We work to create an inclusive environment to build a better company and set a positive example for the world. That's some powerful stuff, simple statements that have a real impact. And then they've got a click through, right, on their social media and on their website that will allow folks to read about ways that they act on diversity. So what are they actually doing? What is their plan? So I love this. I really like the way this company laid it all out. So these are the things that I would love you to walk away from the session with, the key takeaways. If you have any other takeaways other than these, I'd love it if you throw them in chat as well. Diversity, equity, and inclusion enhances your business strategy, right? Incorporate it as a foundation in your daily business conversations. These are not check the box activities. Do your part to create a positive and inclusive working environment. Reflect your organizational values in every interaction. Hold others accountable to do the same along with you. As leaders, be alert to inappropriate conduct. Quickly hold others accountable for failing to demonstrate behaviors that are inclusive. And finally, of course, engage with HR right away or your manager if concerns arise. So I want to share with you one deeper learning opportunity. Starbucks had a racial incident at one of their locations a couple of years ago. It was all over social media and, the news media. And their response was to go to Arizona State University and create this really fantastic curriculum for their employees to address bias. And the way it's set up is through video testimonials, folks talking about their experience of bias. There's one on race, ethnicity, gender, I mean, you name it, right? They're all free. They're called the To Be Welcoming courses. So you can get to them through tobewelcoming.com or go to the Starbucks website and you can click through from there. Okay, so let's go ahead and run through our Q&A. So we'll take a look right now. And it doesn't look like we have anything in the Q&A. Someone asked if they were automatically muted. Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask at this time, remember they can be anonymous. Otherwise, while we wait a little bit to see if anyone has any questions, I'll let you know once I end the session today, you'll be redirected to a quick survey. I would love it if you would take 2 minutes. I swear that's all it'll take. Just let me know, how we did today. Do you feel like this content was valuable? Was it, could you relate to it? Was it useful for you and your organization? And also, what other content would you like to see us present in the future? What would be really helpful to you? So it looks like we're not going to have a lot of questions today, and that is fine. Maybe that means I answered everything. So I'm going to go ahead and end this session. Thank you all so much for taking time with me today, and everyone have an excellent afternoon. Take care. Bye.